You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. Welcome back to part 2 of the Encore series, Doing It Right, Successful Advancement of Law Enforcement Technology, to show how law enforcement is utilizing technological advancements throughout the country. Experts in the field of law enforcement join in the conversation to share their thoughts on current technologies, the true benefits of having various tools, and what it means to the communities they help protect. Part 1 of this series began with opening remarks from Wonton Tat, CEO and co-founder of Clearview AI, a brief conversation between former Director of Programs Charles Fulcher and moderator and board member of the Memorial Fund, Jim Burch, president of the National Policing Institute, followed by Jim's initial thoughts on technology and law enforcement and participant introductions. Part 2 of this series dives into the conversation between Jim Burch and the panel of experts within the field of law enforcement, beginning with Detective Sergeant Jon Kadner from the Cascade County Sheriff's Office in Montana, where his department utilizes specific technological advancements to close cases more efficiently and effectively. Hear from the other experts as they weigh in on their various uses of technology. And now for part 2 of Doing It Right, Successful Advancement of Law Enforcement Technology.
So, Detective, if I can start out with you from the standpoint of an investigator, tell us about how the access to technology generally, or this specific technology, has made a difference in the cases that you've investigated, particularly in terms of how your investigations are better able to bring justice to victims and to make your community safer ultimately.
So one thing that we recently got was the Faro 3D scanner, and that has made a huge difference in our processing of crime scenes. We're able to create essentially a 3D world of your crime scene, and you're able to get more accurate measurements within that crime scene. As we know, human error is involved when you're trying to measure a room. That the tape measure may dip and it won't give you an accurate measurement. So it's improved that human error portion of that. We can create video fly-throughs with that virtual crime scene. And ultimately, once that case is submitted to your district attorney or county attorney's office, that can then be used during that trial. And essentially that jury has the ability to see that crime scene as it was. And a few other things that have improved is the use of digital cameras, obviously. The shift from film cameras to digital was around 2005, 2006. But that has made a huge impact on documenting those crime scenes, making sure that you have good photographs, because ultimately those will also be used in trial for that jury to visualize what was happening. And to add on to that, DNA has made a huge impact on these cases, and the technology has improved to where in the early 2000s, an agency may send off DNA and there wasn't a big enough sample size to get a DNA profile. Now technology has improved to the point where you don't need a big sample to get those results.
So it's making a difference for you, not only in terms of crime scene investigation, but crime scene processing, but also your investigative processes, the ability to generate leads and connect leads. But what I also heard you say that I think was fascinating is that technology is changing the way in which cases may be presented to juries.
That's correct. And there's even talk about VR, virtual reality, being implemented to the jury, where they would actually wear a headset and be able to have a first-person view of that crime scene.
Great. And can you tell me, was there a specific case? I think we had talked to you earlier about a specific case where you used forensic genealogy, so it's called. How did that go?
That's correct. So in 2012, I was assigned a double murder from 1956. And in 2001, investigators sent off a glass slide from the victim, and that was processed and a DNA profile was developed. However, that was obviously put into CODIS and we never received any hits on that. So fast forward, when the Golden State Killer was identified, the use of forensic genealogy was used, genetic genealogy. So that got my wheels turning, and I decided to send that sample back I used Bodhi Technologies, and they were able to identify a new profile that could be used through STR testing. And the problem was, once this individual was identified, we found out that he had passed away in 2007. So we had to find out if he had any living children or family members that we can then test that DNA profile against. And ultimately, through the use of Bodhi Technology and their forensic genealogy department, we were able to identify a family tree, identify the subject, and identify living children that were then compared to that DNA sample, and we did receive a match.
So that, just if you could just affirm what I think I'm hearing there. One of the things that I think is most interesting about that is not only the creative use of the technology, as you mentioned, had been used in other places previously, but the extent that you went to confirm the match, right? So this wasn't simply a situation where you sort of looked up, someone in a genealogy database and made a match and made an assumption that was the suspect. You went further to make that actual confirmation. Is that right?
That's correct. So once you have that subject identified, that's just a lead at that point. Obviously, your goal is to compare that known DNA sample from the crime scene in 1956 to these individuals that are still living. So that required using different agencies in different states. And of course, we did find a family member that lived locally here in Cascade County. So that was a tough discussion too, is when we were getting ready to head out to that house and talk to that family member, is how do we break this to them? How do we get them to provide us with a DNA sample? Because they certainly don't have to. So that was a discussion on the way out there and how we were best going to go about that. So
that's a tough situation, I'm sure, particularly after the person's passed and in the manner it had. But that was a cold case, I assume, right?
It was a cold case.
Chief Aguilar, so what the detective was just telling us really made me think about, all the things that we have to think about before we adopt a new technology. And, as we talk about getting technology right and getting the implementation right, and having the importance of having a well-planned implementation. What led you in Miami to pursue facial recognition technology? Because I know from talking to you previously, that wasn't an easy or a quick decision. You all took time to really think through that. Could you talk about that?
Absolutely, and thanks again for having me on the panel, Jim. So we definitely realized in Miami that we had a significant gap in our ability to both solve and prevent crime and deliver excellent public safety in Miami. As we know, video evidence is now ubiquitous. It's almost become the exception to the rule when you don't have some form of video evidence available in a crime, and this is especially true in an urban environment like Miami. So the U.S. right now is second only to China in terms of per capita video cameras that are recording in public spaces. So think doorbell cameras. Think the fact that everyone walks around with a smartphone. The cameras that are on private businesses, that are on private residences. We used to think of home security equipment that had video cameras as being something that only the very rich could afford. Well, now even doorbell cameras are in the price range of most working and middle class families. But that only gets us half of the way there. So we have a great image of our suspect. We have a great video of our suspect for any range of crimes, but we're still left to answer, who is it? And before, the only tools that we had at our disposal were to put that suspect's image or that video clip on the news and hope that we get a day and a half's worth of coverage, and hope that somebody watching that broadcast could identify the suspect or put out need to identify flyers, hope that some officer somewhere has identified that suspect. And so really facial recognition really helped bridge that gap. And so we had to really think through our implementation. We had to look for best practices, and really this was an area where there was certainly a shortage of best practices. There weren't many agencies that had well-defined policies, and so we had to look for those best practices in places where we thought we didn't think that we would have to look before, and in many cases we had to create those best practices. We also sought public feedback, which we think was very helpful in getting stakeholder buy-in into our use and our implementation, and just putting everything together. We developed a policy around responsible use that we feel does a very good job of balancing privacy interests with public safety interests.
What was how long was that process of consideration? I don't want to, I mean, from the first time that someone mentioned it to you or to others there to the point at which you actually procured the technology, it sounds like you spent quite a bit of time thinking through the pros and cons and how to do it right.
So the way that it happened in Miami was kind of funny. It was when I came into my current role, it was something that I had wanted to pursue. I knew that this gap again in making the most of video evidence was certainly present. I wanted to pursue facial recognition technology, and I was trying to find a way to really find that sound policy to back it up. And so when I stepped into my current role, I said, hey, I want to pursue this. I want to really lead in this space. And so I was told, well, I have good news and bad news. The bad news is we're already using it on a trial basis. The good news is we have absolutely no guiding policy behind it whatsoever. So that was it was an interesting place to start from, but what it did give us was some early success stories that we could bring back to the public and show them, hey, this is what the potential is for this technology. Now we want to help. We need your help to really, tell us exactly how you'd like to see us using this technology, and that's what got us to where we are now.
Well, I hope in a few moments we can come back and dive in a little bit more into that, process specifically, because that's where I want to go next. And Vice President Martin, Ganesha Martin, you have been involved in policing for some time, but in a way that has really allowed you to see kind of what happens when the community is not supporting the police department in terms of the technology that it uses or the technologies it's been given by other people. And that's obviously not a great place to be, but what's the key from your perspective to getting that community trust piece right?
Well, I want to touch on something the chief just said, and thanks for having me today. We talked about, coming in and they had already deployed it with no process. And there were times where, you have your specialized units who come in, you trust them, they're like, Chief, Commissioner, it's this, it's that, and gives you all the pros. And I think often, particularly in the past, we didn't stop and ask those some critical questions. And so the first thing that I would say is get out of your own head. We often make decisions, think about things from a law enforcement perspective, and it makes complete sense. But when we kind of think about it from somebody else's perspective, we might think about it differently. So, one of the other things I say is communicate early and often. In law enforcement, it's very much get the job done, very action oriented towards getting the job done, and we don't communicate. And so I think, that is difficult. Another one, show and tell. One of the things that we started doing in Baltimore after kind of, poking ourselves in the eye a couple of times is actually having press conferences. They were much longer than regular press conferences where we demonstrated new technology and showed the community what we were doing, showed the media what we were doing, and that was helpful. The other thing, and the chief mentioned it, get input when and where you can. Even if you have a meeting that only 3 people show up to, you've got to make an earnest effort to get out there. And you can't necessarily do this with every technology that you're procuring, but when you get the agency in a space of understanding that you'd rather talk about this before you have protesters, before it's the leading national story, before it's all over the news. It's much easier to have the conversations and explain that technology beforehand than under those circumstances. So making sure that you have the community involved. And then the other thing, I kind of touched on this earlier, is one of the things you often hear is this is for law enforcement purposes only. And one of the things that Commissioner Davis did very well was to challenge that and say, okay, well, tell me, why is this for law enforcement purposes only? What, strategy, what crime, in what way, by us divulging this, is it going to put a rank and file person in harm's way? And so kind of challenging that kind of that refrain that comes very often in law enforcement. And the other thing that I think is really kind of people overlook is that data is actually very sensitive for police and community. They both believe that either, and I'm talking in general, there's some communities that we know completely support, the police have, trust, and actually the foundations will pay for the greatest technology. But there's obviously some communities that have less trust. And in those communities, when you talk about technology, when you talk about the data that comes from the technology, the police are reticent to share because they believe the community is just going to kind of skew it. The media is going to skew it and use it against them. And then the community doesn't see that it's just for law enforcement purposes. They see that it's going to be used to oppress and further criminalize them. And so having those conversations early and often important. And then the last thing that I'll say is when you are, having those conversations, doing your show and tell, putting that data out there and being transparent, do it for a couple of different audiences, right? You have, Ms. Johnson, who's the retiree who runs the police community, forums. She may just need some graphs, some charts, something that's very accessible. But then you might have those folks who want to download, they've written white papers, they have the links, charts, all those sorts of things, and so, but you want to be upfront and have those conversations very early. And even if they don't trust you, this is the last thing I'll say. I had one phrase or one thing that I would go by. You could cuss me out once, first time, okay? Not the second time, but people come in angry. They come in with history. They come in with baggage. They come in with distrust. So I would go ahead and have those tough conversations early. And then second conversation, let's try to move into some solutions, but you can cuss me out the first time.
Yeah, Ganesh, I love what you're saying there, and the importance of listening really cannot be overstated, right? I think that's really so essential. And the other thing that I think you've really highlighted here that is important, and there's research from the UK on this, that a lot of the mistrust in this particular area, technology, has less to do with the technology itself and more to do with the larger context of trust. So in the UK, there was a study that was done there that found that to the extent that communities are willing to trust the agency generally, they'll have an easier time accepting new and emerging technologies and how it's used. And so, I think we're talking about technology here today, but building trust matters overall, not just with a particular piece of technology. So great point. I really appreciate you bringing that out. And you mentioned Kevin Davis. Let's make sure folks know who we're talking about there. Kevin, of course, is the former commissioner of the city of Baltimore and now the chief of police in Fairfax County, Virginia, another major city law enforcement agency. So Director Hearn, I want to move over to you now. You spent your career in Texas with the Department of Public Safety, a state agency there, but now working in the private sector. What kinds of experiences and lessons do you bring to the private sector, or would you share with innovators as they're developing solutions based on your experience in law enforcement and what you've seen?
Sure, Jim. Thank you. Yeah, of course, for the state police, at least in Texas, we oversaw all of the CJIS, all the criminal justice information system for the state, all the crime records, all the automated biometrics, the fingerprints, the iris capture. We ran the forensic crime laboratory system for the state. So 14 laboratories doing all the DNA, all the state CODIS applications. And so whether you were talking LPRs or rapid DNA or other emerging technologies that came along over time, one of the main things that seems to be missed sometimes is having a common understanding of what problem you're trying to solve for law enforcement. Is it truly their problem, or are you just bringing technology that solves a problem, right? And so for the innovator, for the technology company, making sure that you have consultation, either in-house or outside, with actual users and people that understand what you're trying to accomplish with your solution, both at the investigative level and at the executive level, because it's two different perspectives, as the chief will tell you, and I think Ganesh will tell you. The understanding and the vision of an investigator using the technology versus the executive talking to community members and talking to local government leaders about why it's okay and how we use the technology is two different things. And from the agency perspective, from the law enforcement perspective, what I have seen, at least on this side, especially with facial recognition and with Clearview, and with the recent advancements through AI and machine learning, and the facial recognition that I used 10 years ago, that law enforcement is used to, has completely been transformed by the new technology. But a lot of our mindsets are still stuck a decade ago, where if I don't have that passport quality photo with no smile and no glasses, straight ahead, I'm not going to accept it. I'm not going to get anything good from it, or I'm going to manipulate my technology to try to get results that I won't normally get. And I end up putting myself in bad situations that I don't have to be in anymore with today's technology. And that kind of goes to the other problem of, if I'm the chief, if I'm the executive, if I'm the city mayor or the manager, the county supervisor, justifying why I'm using a technology that I read every day is inaccurate, or has demographic disparities, or have all of these accusations of being not ready for law enforcement use. So educating yourself to the degree you can, not from a vendor's information, but from what's out there independently about why it's okay to use this technology. And then following up on Ganesh's point, there are some things in law enforcement, tactics, for instance, that we don't share. But everything that we can share, we should share. And we went through this same step with license plate reader technology, putting PIAs out there, private impact assessments on your website. This is the technology. This is what we do with it. This is what we won't do with it. And letting everybody see that what you use this tool for brings that public support in.
Yeah, those are great points. And I'm going to go to the chief to talk more about those policy considerations. I love what you just pointed to here, though, and that is something that is not sexy and it's not interesting to most people, but is vitally important. And that is taking the time to really build a well thought out procurement strategy, really understanding what your requirements are locally, and then what the solution provider may be able to offer. To some extent, we can expect that there may never be a perfect match, but knowing who brings you the closest match, or who's willing to be flexible enough to adapt their solution to the issue that you're addressing, makes the difference, right?
Yeah, and to the community concern and to the law enforcement. Law enforcement should want to have the best available technology that they're going to implement that addresses the problem they're trying to solve, right? And your procurement process can be the first step to ensuring that. Just using this as an example, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, under the Department of Commerce, the world's foremost expert on facial recognition algorithms, has tested more than 150 different algorithms that are 99% or higher accurate across those demographic groups that they test against. The best way to ensure that your technology does not have demographic disparity, that it's accurate technology, is to write into your procurement. I want technology that's been submitted to NIST and that's performed superior. And it's not a monopoly. There's lots of good companies out there doing good things in the market.
And it's a really important thing to make sure our audience knows what that is. So NIST is a part of the Department of Commerce, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, correct.
Tested facial recognition technologies, not once, but multiple times. And we actually had a previous session here at the museum on facial recognition technology. And since then, NIST has updated its report and its findings. And so when you're considering these technologies, or when you're concerned about these technologies, you have to make sure that you're accessing the latest information. Because
right.
As we've said, Director Hearn, and I think most people know, this technology is advancing rapidly, right? Every single day there are advances being made in these technologies. And so their ability to score against these tests is hopefully improving every day as well. So we need to keep that in mind as we consider what we're buying.
Yeah. In fact, realistically, most of the arguments that we're having in the nation, in different states and different cities about accuracy and demographic disparity is all based on information that's 5, 6, 10 years old. The industry has solved that problem. It's done. It's out there. It's been fixed.
Thanks for listening to part 2 of this series about the utilization of technology in law enforcement. Part 3 concludes this series on August 2nd, when the panelists discuss their success with technology, how it's been implemented, the importance of transparency, effectiveness, and accountability. We thank you for your support, and remember, our upcoming episode releases are every Wednesday, and published exclusively on Tuesdays is our monthly Icons episode. We hope you learned something from this episode and will join us next time for another edition of Encore, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. A special thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of Encore, a series from the Precinct 444 podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.